The first time my husband called me a loser in front of my brother, I was standing beside my father's coffin. Not quietly, not under his breath. Daniel actually laughed. "You got the cabin," he said, staring at the paperwork in my trembling hands. Jesus, Emily. Your father really knew how to divide his assets. Across the polished oak table, my brother Michael leaned back in his chair inside the attorney's office, trying and failing not to smile. Outside the windows, snow drifted across downtown Denver in slow white waves. Inside the room smelled like leather old coffee and funeral flowers. Michael had inherited our father's lakeside mansion in Aspen Ridge. 7 bedrooms, private dock, heated driveway, the kind of place featured in luxury real estate magazines. And me. I got an abandoned cabin deep in the Montana woods. Then the attorney slid an old brass key across the table and quietly said, "Your father instructed me to give this to you personally, Mrs. Carter. He said you would understand eventually." That was the moment I realized my father had left behind far more than property. He had left a secret. And somehow, it had my name on it. The funeral had ended 3 hours earlier, but the exhaustion still sat heavy in my bones. I'd barely slept in days. My black wool coat still carried the faint scent of church incense and melting snow. I remember staring at my father's signature on the will while Michael talked numbers with the attorney as casually as if he were buying another investment property. "That place in Aspen alone is worth at least $4 million now," Michael said. "Probably more after renovations." Daniel whistled softly beside me. Dad always did know where to put his money. Dad. Not your father, not Richard. Dad. Daniel only called him that when money was involved. I folded my hands tightly in my lap to stop myself from reacting. After 22 years of marriage, I had learned silence was often safer than honesty. The attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. "There are still property taxes attached to the Montana cabin, of course, but your father established a maintenance trust to assist with expenses." Daniel gave a short laugh. "Maintenance for a shack in the woods." "Daniel," I whispered. What he said, turning toward me, "I'm just being realistic." Michael finally looked at me directly. "You're probably better off selling it anyway, Em. Montana real estate's hot right now. Some outdoorsy idiot from California will buy anything with trees around it." I nodded faintly, though I barely heard him anymore. Because something felt wrong. Not cruel wrong, not unfair. Intentional. My father had not been an emotional man, but he had always been deliberate. Every decision had weight behind it, meaning. Even his silence usually carried purpose. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly remembered something he once told me when I was 16 years old. People only show you who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Sitting in that office, I finally did. The attorney opened a small drawer and removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Emily. Just that. No love, Dad. No flourish. Simple and direct, exactly like him. "He instructed me to tell you not to open this until after your first night in the cabin," the attorney said. Daniel frowned immediately. "What's in it?" "I don't know," the attorney replied carefully. "I never opened it." Daniel reached for the envelope automatically, but I pulled it closer before he could touch it. Something inside me tightened. A tiny instinct. "Protect this." Michael stood and buttoned his expensive charcoal coat. "Well," he said lightly, "looks like Dad gave us both exactly what he thought we deserved." Daniel chuckled again. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. It was old, heavy, warmer than it should have been. And for the first time all day, grief shifted into something else. Curiosity. The drive home from Denver felt longer than usual. Snow covered the interstate in dirty gray slush, while Daniel scrolled through real estate listings on his phone from the passenger seat. "You should sell immediately," he said, "before spring. Remote properties lose value once inspection issues come up." I kept my eyes on the road. I haven't even seen it yet. "You don't need to see it. It's a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It belonged to my father." Daniel sighed dramatically. "Emily, your father barely spoke to you the last few years." That one landed harder than I expected because there was truth in it. Dad and I had never fought. We had simply drifted. After Mom died, something in him closed off permanently. He still called on birthdays, still sent Christmas cards, But conversations became shorter every year. Meanwhile, Michael thrived in Dad's world. Business, investments, expansion, profit. Everything I never cared about. I was just Emily, the daughter who became a librarian instead of a corporate success story, the woman who never had children, the wife whose marriage had slowly become two people sharing bills and silence. By the time we pulled into our driveway in Chicago, darkness had already fallen. Daniel loosened his tie while I stood in the kitchen making tea neither of us would drink. "You know," he said casually, "if you sell the cabin and split the money smartly, we could finally move somewhere decent." Somewhere decent. I looked around our quiet suburban kitchen, the pale yellow walls I painted myself 15 years ago, the ceramic bowl Mom once gave me, the dying orchid on the windowsill. This had once been enough for me. When had it stopped being enough for him? "I think I want to go there first," I said quietly. "To Montana?" "Yes." Daniel stared at me like I'd announced plans to join a circus. "For what?" "I don't know yet." He laughed under his breath and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator. "Emily, listen to yourself. You're acting like this is some kind of movie." Maybe I was. But later that night, lying awake beside my sleeping husband, I kept thinking about the envelope hidden inside my suitcase. And the brass key beside it. And my father's strange final instruction. "Open it after your first night in the cabin." "Not before." "Why?" Around 2 a.m, I quietly got out of bed and walked downstairs. Snow tapped softly against the kitchen windows. The house creaked with winter silence. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there in the dim light for a long time. Then I made the decision. By sunrise, I had booked a flight to Montana. And for reasons I still couldn't explain, I didn't tell Daniel everything. The closer I got to northern Montana, the quieter the world became. By the time I left the tiny regional airport outside Kalispell in a rented Jeep Cherokee, the sky had turned the pale silver color that comes before heavy snow. Pine forests stretched endlessly along both sides of the highway, dark and thick against the frozen landscape. I rolled the heater higher and tightened my grip on the steering wheel as the GPS led me farther north. Farther from Chicago. Farther from Daniel. Farther from the life that suddenly felt strangely distant. I stopped once at a roadside diner outside Whitefish. The waitress looked about 70 and called everyone Hun. Country music played softly through old ceiling speakers, while 3 men in heavy flannel jackets drank coffee at the counter discussing ice fishing conditions. Nobody looked rushed. Nobody looked impressed by themselves. It felt like another country. "You headed up toward Blackwater Ridge?" the waitress asked while refilling my coffee. I nodded. She gave me a curious look. Not much out there except snow and cabins. My father owned property there. "Richard Carter." "That surprised me. You knew him." "Knew of him," she corrected gently. "Quiet man. Came through every winter for years." "Every winter." I stared down into my coffee. Dad had never once invited me. Not once. The waitress smiled kindly. "Road gets rough after mile marker 42. Take it slow around the curves." By the time I reached Blackwater Ridge, snow had started falling steadily. The road narrowed into a winding mountain route surrounded by towering evergreens. My phone signal disappeared entirely. I should have been nervous. Instead, for the first time in months, my chest felt oddly light. No notifications. No emails. No Daniel complaining about money. Just snow, trees, silence. The cabin finally appeared near dusk. I actually missed the driveway the first time because it blended almost completely into the woods. A narrow gravel path curved downhill toward a frozen lake partially hidden behind thick pines. And there it was. The broken shack. I parked slowly and stared through the windshield in disbelief. It wasn't broken at all. Old, yes. Weathered, certainly. But beautiful. The cabin sat beside the lake like something from a winter postcard. Warm amber lights glowed behind the windows. Smoke curled from a stone chimney into the darkening sky. Snow rested heavily across the roofline and cedar porch rails. My father had lied. Or maybe he had wanted everyone else to believe the place was worthless. I stepped out into knee-deep snow and cold mountain air immediately burned my lungs. The silence out there felt enormous. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors shouting through apartment walls. Only wind moving through pine branches. I walked slowly toward the porch boots crunching against frozen snow and unlocked the front door with the brass key. The cabin smelled faintly of cedarwood, old books, and fireplace ash. Homey. Lived in. Not abandoned. A soft yellow lamp glowed beside a leather armchair near the fireplace. A wool blanket had been folded neatly across the back. The kitchen shelves held canned soup, coffee tins, and carefully stacked dishes. Dad had been here recently? Maybe only weeks ago. I removed my gloves, slowly turning in place. The entire room looked exactly like something my father would create if nobody else were around to judge him for it. Simple, quiet, warm. A life stripped down to essentials. My throat tightened unexpectedly. All those years I thought he preferred Michael because Michael understood ambition and business and success. But standing there inside that cabin, I suddenly wondered if my father had simply gotten tired. Tired of pretending wealth mattered more than peace. A loud metallic clank startled me. I jumped and turned sharply toward the back wall just as the heater sputtered violently and shut off. The cabin fell silent. "Oh no," I muttered. I walked over and crouched beside the old furnace unit, pressing random switches with growing panic. Nothing. Outside, snow thickened rapidly. Perfect. I had no signal, no neighbors, no idea what I was doing. Then headlights appeared through the front window. A pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway. Every instinct in my body tightened. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark green parka and knit cap. He moved with calm confidence through the snow before knocking firmly on the front door. I opened it cautiously. He looked to be in his early 50s, broad shoulders, weathered face, gray beginning to touch his beard. His eyes were steady and surprisingly kind. "You Emily Carter?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded toward the dead heater. "Figured that thing would quit eventually." I blinked. "How did you—" "Saw the lights flicker from my place." He pointed vaguely through the trees. "Name's Jack Bennett. Your father usually called me when the furnace acted up." Usually. Another tiny reminder of how little I truly knew about my father's life here. Jack stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. "Mind if I take a look?" Within minutes, he had the front panel open and was replacing something small from a toolbox he carried in his truck. "Pilot sensor," he explained, "happens during heavy cold snaps." "You knew my father well." Jack paused briefly before answering. "Well enough." That answer carried history inside it. Not gossip, not curiosity. Respect. The heater roared back to life. Warm air slowly returned to the cabin. I exhaled in relief. "Thank you." "No problem." He glanced around the room. "You staying long?" "I'm not sure yet." "That's usually how it starts." I smiled faintly despite myself. Jack zipped his coat and headed for the door, then stopped suddenly. "Oh," he said, "your father asked me to give you something if you ever came up here alone." My pulse quickened. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small folded piece of paper. Just 4 words written in my father's handwriting. "Everything important is beneath your feet." I looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" Jack shook his head slowly. "Richard never explained. Said you'd figure it out when the time was right." Then he left. Just like that. The truck headlights disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone again with the storm outside and the strange note trembling slightly in my hand. "Everything important is beneath your feet." I repeated the sentence silently while staring into the fire later that night. The cabin creaked softly around me as wind rattled the windows. Beneath your feet. I looked down absently toward the old braided rug beneath the coffee table. And that was when I noticed it. A scratch mark in the wooden floor. Perfectly rectangular. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound inside the cabin seemed louder after discovering the scratch marks beneath the rug. The fire cracked softly in the stone fireplace, while snowstorm winds brushed against the windows like restless fingers. I sat wrapped in the wool blanket for almost an hour, staring at the floorboards, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the scratches were real, and so was the faint rectangular outline hidden beneath the faded rug. "Everything important is beneath your feet." Dad had chosen those words carefully. He always did. Around midnight, curiosity finally overpowered caution. I grabbed the fireplace poker and knelt beside the rug, my pulse thudding harder than it should have. The braided fabric dragged heavily across the floor, exposing dark pine boards underneath. There it was. A square outline about 3 feet wide, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. A trapdoor. For a few seconds I simply stared at it. Then I laughed softly to myself, though nothing about the moment actually felt funny. "Of course," I whispered into the empty cabin. "Of course you left me a mystery instead of a normal inheritance." I wedged the fireplace poker into a narrow metal ring hidden along the edge and pulled. Nothing. The door didn't move at all. I tried again, harder, straining my shoulder this time, but the wood barely shifted. Whatever was underneath had probably been sealed shut for years. I sat back against the couch, breathing hard, staring at the stubborn square in the floor. Then I remembered Jack. The next morning dawned gray and painfully cold. Fresh snow buried half the porch overnight. I pulled on my boots, wrapped myself in Dad's old flannel coat hanging near the door, and drove carefully through the trees toward the direction Jack's truck had disappeared the night before. His cabin sat about half a mile away beside the lake, smaller than mine, simpler. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney while a weathered golden retriever slept on the porch. Jack opened the door before I even knocked. "You found it," he said calmly. I blinked. "You knew?" "I suspected." He stepped aside and motioned me in. The inside of his cabin smelled like black coffee and pine wood. Framed landscape paintings covered the walls alongside old ranger maps and fishing gear. It felt masculine without being cold. "Lived in." The dog wandered over and pressed warmly against my leg. "That's Scout," Jack said. "He likes people more than I do." I smiled despite myself. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I said. "Sure. How much did my father tell you?" Jack poured coffee into 2 mugs before answering. "Less than you think. More than most." "Not exactly helpful." He handed me a mug and leaned against the counter. Richard trusted very few people. Apparently not even his own daughter. Jack studied me quietly over the rim of his cup. "You sure about that?" I looked away first. Half an hour later we stood together inside my cabin while Jack crouched beside the trap door examining the rusted hinges. "Hasn't been opened in years," he muttered. "You think there's actually something down there?" "Oh, definitely." The certainty in his voice made my stomach tighten. Jack disappeared briefly to his truck and returned carrying heavier tools. 10 minutes later, the rusted seal finally cracked loose with a loud groan. Cold air rushed upward from below. Neither of us spoke immediately. Jack lifted the hatch carefully while I held my breath. Wooden stairs descended into darkness. "Well," he said quietly, "your father certainly knew how to keep secrets." The hidden room beneath the cabin wasn't large, maybe 12 feet across, but every inch of it carried intention. Shelves lined the walls holding weatherproof storage boxes, old journals, rolled maps, and carefully labeled files. A lantern hung from a support beam overhead. Against one wall sat a heavy metal lockbox beside an old cassette player. Dust covered everything, but not thickly. Dad had been down there recently. My chest tightened so sharply it almost hurt. I stepped carefully onto the concrete floor while Jack shined a flashlight around the room. "This doesn't look like random storage," he said quietly. "Number?" It didn't. It looked organized. Prepared. Like my father knew someone would eventually find it. I moved toward the cassette player first because somehow it frightened me more than the paperwork. There was already a tape inside. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed play. Static crackled briefly. Then my father's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, Emily, then you finally came to the cabin." I froze completely. Hearing his voice again after the funeral felt almost unbearable. Older than I remembered, tired, but unmistakably him. "I know this probably feels confusing," he continued. "Maybe even unfair. But there are things your brother never understood about this family. And things I failed to tell you while I still had time." Jack quietly stepped farther away, giving me privacy without leaving entirely. "I made mistakes with Michael," Dad said on the tape. "Too many. I rewarded ambition and ignored character. By the time I realized what kind of man he'd become, it was already too late." I sank slowly onto an old wooden chair. My father exhaled heavily into the recorder. "The Aspen property is drowning in debt. Lawsuits, too. Your brother knows some of it, not all of it. He spent years leveraging family assets behind my back to fund his developments." I closed my eyes. Of course Michael knew. He always knew exactly what he was doing. The cabin land is different, Dad continued. Most people see trees and snow. But 32 years ago, surveyors discovered a protected underground mineral spring beneath this property. The water rights alone could someday be worth millions. I stared blankly at the shelves around me. Millions. Not the mansion. The cabin. Dad's voice softened slightly. But this was never about money, Emily. That sentence hit harder than everything else. Money ruins weak people. It magnifies selfishness. I needed to know whether there was still one person in this family capable of building something instead of consuming it. Tears blurred my vision suddenly. Because for the first time in years, I felt seen by him. Really seen. The tape clicked softly before continuing. There's one more thing. In the lockbox you'll find documents proving ownership rights tied to the spring territory. There's also an unsigned purchase offer from a private corporation. They offered me enough money to buy 3 more mansions like the one Michael inherited. Jack looked over sharply at that. I refused. My father coughed heavily somewhere in the recording. I wanted the land protected. I wanted this place kept alive. And if anyone could understand why, it would be you. The tape ended with static. Silence swallowed the room. Neither Jack nor I spoke for several seconds. Then quietly he said, "Your father loved this place." I nodded slowly, unable to trust my voice. Because suddenly I understood something heartbreaking. Dad hadn't given Michael the mansion because he valued him more. He'd given it to him because he knew exactly what Michael would choose. Status. Appearances. Immediate wealth. But this cabin. This hidden room. This secret life beneath the floorboards. That had been saved for me. And somehow that realization hurt almost as much as it healed. Then Jack opened the metal lockbox. Inside sat Folder's legal documents. And one unsigned contract worth $14 million. I made the mistake of telling Daniel the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. Looking back now, I think some part of me still wanted to believe my marriage could survive honesty. 22 years is a long time to spend building excuses for someone. Even after everything, I still caught myself hoping there was a decent man hiding underneath Daniel's selfishness. There wasn't. The moment I mentioned the mineral rights, his entire personality changed. At first it happened subtly. His voice softened over the phone. He asked how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough. He even called me Em again, a nickname he hadn't used in years. Then came the questions. How much land are we talking about exactly? What kind of companies are interested? Did your father sign anything official? I stood at the kitchen sink while he talked, staring out at the frozen lake beyond the trees. Jack had spent most of the afternoon helping me organize documents from the hidden room. The old journals alone contained decades of notes about the property, local wildlife water studies, and handwritten observations from my father. It wasn't just land to him. It had become sanctuary. I don't know everything yet, I told Daniel carefully. Well, figure it out, he said immediately. You can't trust small-town lawyers with something this valuable. Small-town lawyers? I almost laughed. Daniel always talked about places like Montana as though civilization stopped existing outside major cities. I'm handling it, I said quietly. There was a brief pause. Then his voice changed again. Sharper this time. Emily, don't start getting emotional about this place. That word. Emotional. Daniel used it any time he wanted to dismiss my opinion without openly insulting me. You barely even knew your father anymore, he continued. This isn't some magical healing journey. It's property, valuable property. I gripped the edge of the counter harder. Outside, snow drifted lazily across the lake while smoke rose from Jack's chimney through the trees nearby. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I suddenly didn't want Daniel anywhere near this place. I'm tired, I said. I'll call you tomorrow. But he called first. The next morning, just after sunrise. I booked a flight, he announced. I'll be there tonight. My stomach dropped. You didn't ask me. I'm your husband. The way he said it sounded less like love and more like ownership. By late afternoon, another snowstorm had rolled across Blackwater Ridge. Jack stopped by carrying fresh groceries from town while I stacked files across the dining table. You look worried, he observed. Daniel's coming. Jack nodded once slowly. No judgment. No unnecessary questions. but something in his expression shifted. What I asked. He hesitated. Your father didn't think highly of him. That much was obvious. No, Jack said carefully. I mean, he genuinely distrusted him. I looked up sharply. Jack leaned against the counter with his coffee mug warming both hands. Richard told me once that some people spend their entire lives searching for doors into other people's fortunes. The sentence landed heavily between us. Daniel's not a criminal, I said automatically. Jack didn't argue. That somehow made it worse. Daniel arrived after dark, driving a rented SUV covered in road salt and slush. He barely glanced at the lake or surrounding forest before stepping into the cabin. His eyes went immediately to the documents spread across the table. Well, he said slowly, this changes things. Not how are you? Not this place is beautiful. Not I missed you. Just this changes things. He removed his expensive wool coat and walked around the cabin, inspecting everything like a potential investor. I watched him move through the room with growing emotional distance. For the first time I saw him clearly. Not cruel exactly. Not evil. Just deeply relentlessly self-interested. You should have told me sooner, he said while flipping through one of the folders. I only found out yesterday. Still. He looked around again. Honestly, your father played this brilliantly. Michael gets the flashy mansion while the real asset sits hidden out here. Asset. Everything became business language with Daniel eventually. That night over dinner, he talked non-stop about development opportunities. Luxury eco-resorts. Private fishing retreats. Corporate wellness investments. I barely touched my food. You know what this place needs, he said excitedly. A high-end lodge, minimalist cabins. Rich people pay insane money for authentic wilderness experiences. This isn't a business pitch, I said quietly. He frowned. Emily, don't be naive. Naive. Another favorite word of his. Across the room, firelight flickered against my father's old bookshelves, while wind rattled softly outside. I suddenly remembered how peaceful the cabin had felt before Daniel arrived. Now every room felt smaller. Tenser. Like the walls themselves disliked him. The next morning got worse. Michael showed up. Apparently Daniel had called him. My brother stepped out of a black Range Rover wearing polished boots, completely unsuited for Montana snow. He hugged me stiffly before immediately asking to see the contracts. You should have brought lawyers into this already, he said while scanning documents at the table. If these water rights are legitimate, this property's worth exponentially more than Dad's estate valuation. Daniel nodded eagerly beside him. The two of them fell naturally into business conversation while I stood near the fireplace, feeling strangely invisible inside my own cabin. Then Michael casually said something that changed everything. You know, Dad always worried Emily was too soft for real financial decisions. Jack had stopped by earlier to repair a frozen pipe outside. He entered quietly through the mudroom carrying tools just in time to hear that sentence. Neither Michael nor Daniel noticed him immediately. But I did. And suddenly, for the first time in years, embarrassment burned hotter than sadness. Because these men weren't discussing my future. They were discussing how to control it. Daniel poured coffee while laughing softly. Exactly. She gets emotionally attached to things. That's why we need to move fast before she starts thinking this place has sentimental value. We need to move fast. Something inside me went completely still. Jack quietly set his toolbox down near the door. Michael finally noticed him. Oh, sorry, didn't realize someone else was here. Jack looked at me before answering. Not them. Me. I was just leaving, he said calmly. But before he walked out, he placed something gently beside my coffee cup. Another envelope. My father's handwriting. For Emily only. My pulse quickened instantly. Michael reached toward it automatically. What's that? I picked it up before he could touch it. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, I heard my own voice without hesitation. That, I said quietly, is none of your business. I waited until everyone went to bed before opening the envelope. Daniel and Michael had spent the evening drinking whiskey near the fireplace, discussing zoning laws and investment possibilities while pretending not to pressure me. Every few minutes, one of them casually mentioned numbers large enough to make ordinary people dizzy. 15 million. 20 million? Future development opportunities. As if my father's cabin had already stopped being a real place. as if it had already become a transaction. By 11 o'clock, Michael finally left for the lodge in town, while Daniel fell asleep on the couch with financial documents spread across his chest like trophies. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the envelope beneath the warm light above the sink. For Emily only. My father's handwriting looked shakier this time. Older. Sicker. Outside, snow fell steadily over the frozen lake while pine branches swayed gently in the wind. The cabin felt quieter at night, more honest somehow. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded 3 times. Emily. If you are reading this, then Michael and your husband have probably already started circling this place like starving men around a wounded animal. I'm sorry for speaking so plainly, but age eventually strips away a person's patience for lies. I sat down slowly at the table. Your mother wanted this cabin left to you long before she died. Not because of the land, not because of the water, because this place once saved us. I closed my eyes briefly. Dad rarely mentioned Mom after the funeral. It had always felt like speaking about her physically hurt him. The first year of our marriage, we lived in this cabin through one of the harshest winters Montana had seen in decades. We had almost no money. I worked construction during the day and repaired snowmobiles at night. Your mother taught piano lessons in town for $5 an hour. But we were happy here. Happier than we ever were inside large houses. I swallowed hard. Daniel stirred slightly in the next room but didn't wake. Then came the sentence that broke something open inside me. You have your mother's heart, Emily. That frightened me for years because kind people often suffer the most in this world. Tears blurred the page instantly. Not dramatic tears. Not movie tears. Just silent exhaustion finally spilling over after years of holding myself together. Your brother inherited my ambition. You inherited the ability to care about things money cannot replace. I spent too much of my life rewarding the wrong qualities. I thought success meant expansion, more property, more status, more admiration. But your mother understood something I did not. A peaceful life is worth more than an impressive one. The fire cracked softly nearby. I wiped my face and continued reading. I know Daniel sees this land as opportunity. Michael sees it as leverage. But I left it to you because you are the only person I trusted not to destroy it trying to prove something to the world. The room suddenly felt very small. Very still. I looked toward the dark window above the sink where my reflection stared back at me, 46 years old. Tired eyes, silver beginning to thread through brown hair I no longer bothered coloring. For so long I had quietly accepted everyone else's definition of me. The sensitive one. The weak one. The disappointment. And now somehow my father's final words were rearranging pieces inside me I hadn't realized were broken. Near the bottom of the letter, his handwriting became noticeably weaker. There's one more truth you deserve to know. The mansion Michael inherited is financially ruined. The maintenance alone will drain him within years unless he sells it quickly. I suspect he already knows that. I left it to him anyway because some lessons only arrive after people run out of things to blame. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Dad knew. He had known exactly how all of this would unfold. Then came the line that stayed with me long after everything else faded. This cabin was never meant to make someone rich, Emily. It was meant to save someone's soul. I covered my mouth with my hand. Because suddenly I understood why Dad had hidden everything beneath the floorboards instead of leaving money directly. He wasn't testing intelligence. He was testing character. And for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe I had spent my entire marriage failing that test myself. The next morning, Daniel woke cheerful. Suspiciously cheerful. He made coffee, asked if I slept well, even kissed the top of my head while I stood at the stove. The performance almost would have been convincing if I hadn't spent 2 decades learning how to recognize his moods based on financial circumstances. You know, he said casually, I was thinking maybe we should move here part-time once this all settles. I nearly laughed. 2 weeks ago, he called the cabin a worthless shack. Now he wanted mountain life. Why, I asked quietly. It could be good for us. Us. That word suddenly sounded hollow. Before I could answer, headlights appeared outside. Jack. Relief hit me harder than expected. Daniel noticed immediately. You've gotten pretty friendly with the neighbor. The tone underneath the sentence made me look up sharply. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, he shrugged, just saying. But I knew Daniel well enough to hear what he wasn't saying aloud. Jack entered carrying a paper grocery bag filled with fresh bread and canned supplies from town. Roads are supposed to close tonight, he said. Figured you might need these. Daniel stood slowly from the table. We're fine, he replied before I could speak. Jack ignored the hostility completely and set the groceries down near the counter. Then he looked at me directly. You okay? Such a simple question. But something about the way he asked it nearly shattered me. Because he actually wanted the answer. Daniel suddenly grabbed his coat from the chair. I'm heading into town. For what, I asked. Cell service, calls. The moment the door closed behind him, the cabin exhaled. Jack noticed it too. He's angry, he said carefully. No, I replied softly, he's scared. Jack studied me for a moment. There's a difference. I looked down at Dad's letter still folded beside my coffee cup. Yes, I said quietly. One of those emotions can still love you. The silence that followed felt heavier than snow. Then Jack spoke again. Emily, there's something else your father told me before he died. I looked up. He said if Daniel ever started talking about divorce after discovering the land value. Jack hesitated carefully. Then you should check whether he already had someone waiting. My chest tightened instantly. An hour later, while Daniel showered upstairs before driving back into town again, his phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to snoop. At least that's what I told myself. But the screen lit up before I could look away. Miss you already, Claire. I stared at the message while hot water ran upstairs. Then another notification appeared. Can't wait until this is finally over. Something inside me went completely cold. I didn't confront Daniel immediately. That surprised even me. 5 years earlier, I probably would have dissolved into tears right there in the kitchen. I would have demanded explanations, asked what I did wrong, begged for honesty while blaming myself for things I didn't break. But something inside me had changed since arriving in Montana. Maybe it was the silence here. Maybe it was my father's letters. Or maybe I was simply too exhausted to keep pretending anymore. I placed Daniel's phone exactly where I found it and stepped outside into the snow. The air hit my lungs sharply. Jack was standing near the woodpile, splitting kindling with steady, controlled movements. The sound of the axe cutting through frozen wood echoed softly through the trees. He looked up the moment he saw my face. You found out, he said quietly. Not a question. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself against the cold. How long did you know? I didn't know for certain. But you suspected. Jack lowered the axe slowly. Your father did. That hurt more than I expected. Not because Daniel had betrayed me, but because everyone else had seen the truth before I did. I laughed once under my breath, though there wasn't any humor in it. I spent 22 years trying to become enough for someone who had already left emotionally before I even noticed. Snow drifted softly between us. Jack walked closer but stopped at a respectful distance. That kind of thing happens slowly, he said. People don't usually see it while they're living inside it. Tears threatened again, but this time I held them back. Not because I was numb. Because I suddenly understood crying wouldn't change anything anymore. I think part of me always knew, I admitted quietly. I just didn't want to be alone at 46. Jack's expression softened. You are alone, he said gently. You've been alone for years. The honesty should have hurt. Instead, it felt like someone opening a window in a suffocating room. Behind us, the cabin door opened. Daniel stepped onto the porch, adjusting his coat. Roads clearing up, he announced casually before noticing the expression on my face. Then his eyes shifted to Jack. Something defensive flickered there immediately. What's going on? I looked at him calmly. For the first time in our marriage, truly calmly. Who's Claire? The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel didn't panic. Didn't deny it. That somehow made everything worse. He just exhaled heavily and shoved his hands into his coat pockets. You went through my phone. There's someone else. His jaw tightened slightly. It's complicated. No, I said quietly, it really isn't. Jack immediately started walking back toward his truck. Daniel noticed. You don't need to leave. Yes, Jack replied without turning around. I do. Then he drove away, leaving the two of us standing alone in falling snow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. I wasn't planning for you to find out like this. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny, because the sentence sounded absurdly familiar, as though my inconvenience was discovering his betrayal too early. How long? A few months. Only a few months. 22 years reduced to a few careless words. She understands me better, he continued quickly. Things with us haven't been good for a long time, Emily. There it was. The justification. People always want their betrayal to sound reasonable. I looked past him toward the frozen lake. You were going to leave me after the property deal closed. Daniel didn't answer, which was answer enough. I wasn't trying to hurt you. That finally pulled my eyes back toward him. Hurt me, I repeated softly. Daniel, you stopped loving me so gradually I barely noticed it happening. For the first time all morning, genuine discomfort crossed his face. I did love you. Maybe once. The wind picked up sharply around us. Snow swirled across the porch, while somewhere deeper in the woods a branch cracked beneath ice. Daniel stepped closer. Look, this doesn't have to become ugly. We can still handle things fairly. Fairly? Meaning money? Always money. I'm filing for divorce, I said. His expression hardened instantly. Don't be dramatic. I'm not. You think this place changed you overnight? No, I replied calmly. I think this place helped me finally see myself clearly. That ended the conversation. Not because Daniel understood. Because he realized he was losing control of it. 3 days later he left Montana. And before he boarded his flight back to Chicago, he made one final mistake. He threatened me. Not violently. Financially. You realize half of everything acquired during the marriage belongs to me too, he said while standing beside his rental SUV. I nodded once. I know. What Daniel didn't know yet was that my father had anticipated this exact scenario years earlier. The trust protecting the land had been established before my marriage ever began. The mineral rights water contracts and protected acreage legally belonged only to me. Dad had protected the cabin from everyone, including my husband. Daniel discovered that a week later after speaking with attorneys in Chicago. He called screaming. Actually screaming. You knew, he shouted through the phone. You already knew the trust blocked marital claims. I found out recently. This is unbelievable. No, I said quietly. What's unbelievable is that you stayed married to someone you stopped loving because you thought there might eventually be money involved. He hung up after that. The divorce process moved surprisingly fast. Claire apparently disliked waiting. Michael's situation collapsed almost as quickly. Within 2 months, lawsuits tied to the Aspen property surfaced publicly. Back taxes, unpaid development loans, environmental violations connected to one of his luxury resort projects. The mansion became an anchor dragging him underwater financially. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, my brother stopped sounding superior. He sounded tired. One evening near the end of February, Jack invited me to drive with him out toward the northern ridge above the lake. Snow covered the mountain roads in silver moonlight, while old country songs played softly through his truck speakers. Neither of us talked much. It felt easy. Comfortable. We parked near a frozen overlook where the entire valley stretched below us, glowing pale blue beneath the winter sky. My wife loved this view, Jack said quietly after a long silence. It was the first time he'd mentioned her. I'm sorry, I said softly. She died 8 years ago. He stared out across the mountains. Cancer. The pain in his voice wasn't fresh anymore. But it was permanent. We stood together outside the truck while snow drifted lightly around us. I forgot what peace felt like after she died, he admitted. Then your father dragged me out here fishing one winter and basically refused to let me disappear from the world. I smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Jack looked at me then. Not intensely. Not possessively. Just honestly. You look different now, he said. How? Like you finally stopped apologizing for existing. The words hit me harder than any compliment ever had. Because deep down, I knew they were true. 2 years later, the cabin no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like home. Spring arrived slowly in Blackwater Ridge. Snow melted from the mountains in silver streams that fed the lake below the cabin, and wildflowers pushed through the earth beside the porch Dad once repaired with his own hands. Some mornings I still woke before sunrise just to sit outside with coffee wrapped in both hands, listening to the woods come alive. Wind through pine trees. Loons calling across the water. The distant rumble of logging trucks farther down the valley. Simple sounds. Real sounds. The kind of sounds you miss your entire life if you're too busy chasing noise. The bookstore opened during our second summer in town. It wasn't large. Just an old hardware store on Main Street we renovated slowly with help from local volunteers and a retired carpenter named Earl who complained constantly but secretly enjoyed every minute of it. We called it Lantern Books and Cafe because Jack said the warm lights glowing through the windows during snowstorms reminded him of old railroad lanterns. Tourists stopped in during summer fishing season. Locals came year-round. Some bought books. Some only wanted coffee and conversation. I loved both equally. A small shelf near the register displayed photographs of the town from decades earlier. One of them showed my father standing beside a younger Father Arseny outside the tiny chapel near the woods. Dad looked uncomfortable in the photo, almost annoyed to be caught smiling. But he was smiling. That mattered to me. The clinic opened 6 months after the bookstore. Not a giant hospital. Not some grand vanity project with my family name stamped across glass buildings. Just a clean modern medical center with 3 doctors, a pediatric wing, and enough equipment that elderly residents no longer had to drive 2 hours through mountain roads for basic care. The first day it opened, Father Arseny cried during the blessing ceremony. Actually cried. The old priest's hands shook while he touched the doorway and whispered prayers in Russian under his breath. Later that afternoon, he sat beside me outside on a bench overlooking the mountains. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. I shook my head softly. He'd probably complained the parking lot was too small. The old priest laughed so hard he nearly spilled his tea. Then his expression softened. "You know," he said, "Richard spent many years believing success meant becoming important." He looked toward the clinic windows glowing in late afternoon sunlight. But near the end of his life he understood something else. "What?" Father Arseny smiled gently. "That being needed matters much more." Those words stayed with me. Especially at night. Especially during quiet moments. Michael visited only once after the lawsuits. The Aspen mansion had eventually been sold below market value to cover debt settlements. By then he looked older somehow, smaller. The sharp confidence he carried his entire life had worn thin around the edges. We sat together awkwardly on the cabin porch one October afternoon, while yellow leaves drifted across the lake. "I used to think Dad loved me more," he admitted finally. I looked over at him in surprise. He stared out toward the water. "But I think maybe he just understood me less than he understood you." For the first time in our lives there wasn't competition in his voice. Only regret. I didn't know how to answer that. So instead I handed him another cup of coffee. Sometimes healing begins in silence. Daniel remarried Claire less than a year after our divorce finalized. Ironically, that marriage lasted only 8 months. I heard about it through mutual friends back in Chicago, though by then, gossip felt strangely unimportant. Apparently, Claire enjoyed expensive vacations more than Daniel's actual personality once financial expectations collapsed. Some people spend their whole lives trying to build relationships out of transactions. Eventually, the bill arrives. As for Jack, well, some love stories happen loudly. Ours didn't. There was no dramatic confession in the rain, no grand speeches, no fireworks. Just thousands of small things. He fixed the bookstore roof during a spring storm without being asked. I learned how he took coffee black, no sugar, always too hot. He started leaving fresh trout wrapped in butcher paper outside my door after fishing trips. I started baking extra cornbread knowing he'd accidentally stop by around dinner time. Some nights we simply sat together on the porch, saying nothing at all while snow fell across the lake. And somehow, after years of feeling invisible inside my own marriage, being quietly cherished felt almost overwhelming. The final cassette tape from my father stayed untouched for months. I couldn't bring myself to play it. Not because I was afraid. Because I wasn't ready for goodbye. But one winter evening, almost exactly 2 years after arriving in Montana, I finally carried the tape downstairs into the hidden room beneath the cabin. The old lantern still hung from the ceiling beam. Dad's journals remained carefully organized on the shelves beside maps and photographs. I sat alone beside the cassette player while snow tapped softly against the cabin overhead. Then I pressed play. Static crackled briefly. And there he was again. Older. Tired. But calm. If you're hearing this, my father said softly, then you finally stopped letting other people decide your value. My eyes closed instantly. I spent too many years confusing admiration with love. Don't make the same mistake I did. There was a long pause on the tape. Then his voice grew quieter. People will tell you success is measured by money status or influence. But near the end of life, none of that keeps you warm at night. The floorboards creaked gently above me as winter wind moved through the trees outside. What matters, Dad continued, is whether you built something good for other people while you were here. I cried then. Not from grief anymore, but from understanding. By the time I climbed back upstairs, the fire had burned low in the fireplace. Jack was standing in the kitchen making tea like he belonged there, which by then he did. He looked over as I entered. You okay? I smiled through tears and nodded. Outside, snow drifted peacefully across the frozen lake, while warm golden light filled the cabin windows. And for the first time in my life, I finally felt at home. If this story touched you in some way, I'd truly love to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from, or share a moment in your own life when you finally realized your worth. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about second chances, family secrets, healing, and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the